You know, many people only realize they've been living beside a narcissist when they look back and see that they have slowly become a different version of themselves. A version that is overly cautious, overly restrained, constantly monitoring every word just to avoid conflict. You walk softly, speak quietly, shrink your presence not because that is who you are, but because you've grown used to keeping the other person stable. You avoid topics that might upset them. You hold back your real emotions out of fear of being judged. You continuously adjust yourself to fit their moods, their expectations, and their fragile ego. Slowly but surely, you lose access to your own emotional space. And the painful part is that you start believing it's your fault, that you are too demanding, too sensitive, or not good enough. But in truth, from a psychological perspective, this is a common response when someone spends too long near a person who absorbs emotional energy without ever giving anything back. A narcissist doesn't need to yell to control you. They only need to make you shrink a little more each day. But eventually, there comes a moment quiet yet unmistakable when you realize you no longer recognize yourself. And that moment is the first step out of the spiral. The moment you reclaim your right to breathe, to feel, and to exist without asking for permission. And in today's video, we're going straight into 7 subtle yet powerful tactics, psychological moves that can make a narcissist twist inside their own ego, so you can reclaim ownership of your emotions and your life. And from the moment you realize you no longer want to live in an emotional rhythm dictated by someone else, we step into the very first way to reclaim ownership of your life. And that brings us to the first method, silence. The slap without sound. Silence may look passive on the surface, but to a narcissist, it is a direct strike at their lifeline. You see, they survive on attention the way we survive on oxygen. Any reaction you give a justification, a burst of anger, a tear becomes fuel for them. A narcissist doesn't need your love, they only need your reaction. Because when you react, they know they still have power over you. That is why silence drives them absolutely insane. When you stop responding, stop explaining, stop stepping into the arguments they carefully construct, you are shutting down the channel they rely on to maintain their illusion of control. And that's when panic begins. They will try everything to provoke an emotional response from you, poking your insecurities, blaming you, switching into victim mode, sharing dramatic stories, anything to pull you back into the game. But when you stay rooted in silence, no reaction, no reversal, no explanation, their power system begins to crack. This is not surrender, this is refusal. This is a silent declaration. You no longer have access to my emotional world. By good need. And let me be honest, staying silent won't feel easy at first, especially if you're used to explaining yourself to be understood or used to keeping peace by absorbing the damage. But with practice, you'll feel something shift, the quiet realization that you owe a narcissist nothing. Not your attention, not your emotions, not your rescue. What terrifies them most isn't your anger. What terrifies them is your absence of reaction. Because when you stop creating noise, they're forced to face the emptiness inside themselves. And that is the one thing a narcissist spends their entire life avoiding. And once silence begins to reclaim your emotional space, the next step is to reinforce your boundaries, something a narcissist despises just as much as your indifference. And this brings us to the second method, brutal boundaries. Say less, enforce more. With healthy people, boundaries can be communicated gently. They'll try to honor them. But with a narcissist, softness becomes an invitation, an opening they can negotiate, twist, or exploit. They don't respond to reminders. They respond to consequences. That's why boundaries with them must be sharp, firm, and entirely non-negotiable. You don't say, "I'd prefer if you didn't do that." You say, "If that happens, I will leave." No warnings disguised as kindness. No emotional cushioning. No offering them a loophole to manipulate. Just the rule and action the moment it's crossed. And here's the part many people underestimate. A narcissist will always test you. They want to know whether your boundary is solid or just something you say to feel stronger. One moment of hesitation from you, and they will interpret it as permission to push harder. Because to a narcissist, a boundary isn't a boundary, it's simply a challenge. Many people feel guilty when enforcing harsh boundaries, especially if they've spent years being the caretaker, the peacekeeper, or the explainer. But in the context of a narcissistic dynamic, boundaries aren't cruelty, they're survival. If you don't protect yourself, they will consume every last inch of your emotional stability. And here is the most crucial truth. Do not apologize for protecting your peace. Do not explain why you said no. You owe no justification for guarding your inner world. Every time you enforce a boundary without wavering, you aren't just stopping the narcissist, you're teaching yourself something powerful. I am no longer someone who can be pushed around. And that strength, that refusal to be moved, is exactly what a narcissist cannot handle. Once boundaries are set, the next thing you must reclaim is emotional control, the very tool narcissists rely on to manipulate you. And that brings us to the third method, emotional flatness, denying them the stage. If silence cuts off their energy supply, then emotional flatness is how you shut down the internal power grid they use to dominate your reactions. Narcissists are addicted to drama. They thrive on intensity, your anger, your tears, your defensiveness, your explanations. Every emotional response tells them they still influence your inner world. That's why one of the most powerful tactics you can use is calmness, or more precisely, the appearance of calmness, steady and unshaken. You don't shake your head, you don't frown, you don't fall into their baited questions or try to make them understand. You don't serve them another emotional moment. Instead, you stand there with measured breath, a grounded voice, and a gaze that reveals nothing, as if you've revoked their access to your emotional system entirely. It's not that you feel nothing. It's that you choose not to show anything. You refuse to let them step into the emotional space they once exploited so easily. And the moment they realize they can no longer provoke or shape your internal state, panic sets in. They start digging into your past. They revive old mistakes. They invent narratives. They gaslight. They slip into victim mode. They do anything to trigger a reaction, not because they seek truth, but because they need proof that they still matter. Yet the less you react, the more disoriented they become, the more powerless, the more deprived. What terrifies a narcissist isn't your anger. Anger is still energy. What truly crushes them is the realization that you no longer feel anything for them. That is the moment they sense you stepping out of the role they cast you in. And once you master emotional flatness, you don't just take away their weapon, you reclaim authority over your own body and mind, something a narcissist never wanted you to rediscover. Once you've mastered emotional flatness, the next step is reclaiming what a narcissist treats as their lifeline, your attention. And that brings us to the fourth method, cutting off attention, starving their supply until they suffocate. You need to understand this clearly. A narcissist doesn't merely enjoy attention, they are addicted to it. Every glance you give them, every message you respond to, every emotional pulse you reveal, whether anger, frustration, or sympathy, acts like a fresh dose of fuel for their inflated yet hollow ego. They don't care whether the attention is positive or negative. As long as you react, they remain alive in your psychological space. That's why the most devastating move you can make is to cut off that attention entirely. You stop replying. You stop checking their updates. You stop monitoring their moods. You no longer offer polite, peacekeeping gestures. You refuse to fall for messages like, "We need to talk," "Something big just happened," or "I've changed." You become a black hole absorbing everything that once flowed toward them, but giving nothing back. And this suffocates them. In a narcissist's world, they are the axis around which everything revolves. They expect your focus, your reactions, your emotional labor, but when you go still, when you turn them into nothing, panic sets in. They escalate, they bring up old memories. They pretend to be hurt, they fabricate crises, they present themselves as newly enlightened. All of it designed to coax even a single thread of attention from you. Because to them, even one tiny reaction means their influence remains intact. But this time, you give them nothing. And here is the beauty of this method. Cutting off attention doesn't just destabilize them, it frees you. You reclaim your time, your mind, your emotional bandwidth. You begin to see your energy as a powerful psychological currency, and you realize you never owed it to someone who never valued it in the first place. This is the moment you don't just escape them, you return to yourself. Once you've cut off your attention, the next step is the one a narcissist fears most. You begin thriving without them. And that brings us to the fifth method, living well, the existential revenge. There is nothing more painful to a narcissist than seeing you rise, heal, and rebuild your life without depending on them. They cling to the fantasy that you are weak without them, that you'll wander back for validation, approval, or emotional scraps. But when you start reclaiming your peace, sleeping better, nourishing yourself properly, laughing genuinely, reconnecting with healthy relationships, investing in your career, the entire power structure they built begins to collapse. Because living well is not about showing them anything. It is not revenge in the conventional sense. It is existence beyond their reach. It proves one thing they cannot bear to admit: you were never theirs to define. And what hurts them is not your success, it's your indifference to whether they witness it. You're not posting pictures for them to see. You're not subtly signaling your happiness. You are living well because you deserve to, and that makes them powerless. When you truly invest in yourself, every control mechanism they once relied on becomes useless. You no longer need their praise to feel valuable. You no longer seek their approval to feel confident. You no longer position them as the emotional sun your life orbits around. You reclaim the right to define who you are, and that is something a narcissist cannot tolerate. Because the moment you stand as a whole, independent person, they lose every foothold. They lose the role of most important figure in your life. They lose the illusion of ownership. They lose the story they've always believed, that you would never leave, that your worth depended on them, that you were a permanent supply. Now, they are simply the past. And what wounds them most is not that you left, but that you no longer carry them with you into your future. Once you've learned to live better and no longer revolve around them, you step into a level a narcissist cannot tolerate. You stop playing in the fog they create. And that brings us to the sixth method. Speak the truth directly. No arguments, no getting pulled in. A narcissist maintains power through confusion. They twist the story, reverse roles, force you to explain yourself, make you question your own perception, and keep you running after them trying to correct the truth. The more you explain, the deeper they pull you into the maze of their distorted logic. But when you state the truth clearly, calmly, without emotional charge, their entire manipulation system begins to collapse. You don't yell. You don't prove anything. You don't engage in endless debates. You simply speak in a normal, steady voice. That is not what happened, and I'm not arguing. Or, you are trying to shift the blame onto me, and I'm not participating. Just those two sentences are enough to throw them off balance. Because when you speak the truth with clarity, you sever the emotional hook they rely on to control you. They can no longer steer the conversation. They can no longer rewrite the narrative. They can no longer create a fog thick enough to disorient you. And immediately, you'll see the familiar reaction: a dismissive laugh, mockery, intensified gaslighting, claims that you remember wrong, that you're too sensitive, or that you're making a big deal out of nothing. All of it is designed to lure you back onto their playing field, the only place where they have the disadvantage. But this time, you don't step onto that field. You remain grounded in your own reality. No arguing, no defending, no trying to make them understand. You speak the truth the way you would place a stone on solid ground, firm, heavy, immovable by their words. And once truth is laid out like that, a narcissist has nowhere left to hide behind the stories they've built. The most liberating part is this: when you can state the truth without needing their agreement, you have already escaped the trap they constructed long ago. You no longer need their validation of your memory, your emotions, or your reasoning. You reclaim the right to define your own reality, and that is something they cannot bear. Once you've spoken the truth directly and stopped being led by them, you enter the final stage where you don't just escape the narcissist, but escape the entire game they have forced you to play. And that brings us to the seventh method, exiting the game, reclaiming your right to live for yourself. After everything, the goal is not to defeat a narcissist, because in their game, you can never win. The rules are written so that they are always the victor. What truly matters is that you no longer allow them to control your reality. A narcissist survives by rewriting the story, switching roles, distorting memories, making you doubt yourself, pushing you to question whether your emotions are valid or whether your recollection can be trusted. They create a version of reality in which they are always right, always the victim, and you are always the one at fault. But when you stand firmly in your own reality, you break free from that entire matrix. You no longer need them to understand you. You don't need their apology. You don't need them to change. You stop searching for a perfect ending, a sincere explanation, or some moment of awakening from them, because you finally understand none of that will ever come. And it is precisely when you stop waiting, stop expecting, and stop hoping that one day they will see your worth or acknowledge their wrongdoing, that is when you win. Not win against them, but win against the cycle that kept you trapped for so long. You hold on to your own memory. You trust the truth you witnessed. You trust the emotions your body tried to tell you. You trust your own interpretation of what happened. And when you do that, the narcissist loses the one weapon that ever gave them power, the ability to make you doubt yourself. Without that doubt, you cannot be manipulated. Without being manipulated, you no longer belong to their game. You step out, you close the door, you choose your own life, a life that no longer revolves around their shadow. And that is what they hate the most. They no longer have the right to exist in the story you are writing for yourself. When you reach the end of this journey, you'll realize a truth that seems simple but has the power to change your entire life. The narcissist was never the real problem. It was the influence they had over you that brought you to your knees, and once that influence dissolves, their power disappears with it. The 7 methods you've just learned are not weapons for you to attack them. They are doors leading you back to yourself, to the place where you no longer react to their shadows, no longer orbit their emotional storms, no longer perform in the story they wrote for you. Your silence cuts off their supply. Your boundaries stop their invasion. Your emotional flatness takes away the stage they need to perform. Your withdrawal of attention suffocates their ego. Your ability to live well shatters their illusion. Your truth exposes them to themselves. And when you exit the game entirely, you reclaim the right to live on your own terms. When you look at the pattern as a whole, you'll see it clearly. Every step is about reclaiming the self they spent so long trying to erode. A narcissist does not change, but you can, and your transformation is the one thing they can never control. You don't need to persuade them. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to defeat them. You only need to move forward step by step, boundary by boundary, truth by truth, until one day you look back and realize they no longer hold historical power over your life. No more voice, no more influence, no more place. You've reclaimed something you didn't even know you were allowed to have. Absolute inner freedom. And once you stand firmly in that place, calm, clear, no longer trembling, the only thing the narcissist has left is the shadow you walked past long ago.